Right. So as I said, we're talking about assessment or exam stress in general. So yesterday you would have had your workshop around what assessments look like and the rubrics and the grades. So I guess the more academic side. Today we're looking at the mental health and well-being side to all of that when there are upcoming tests or exams. How we can help young people, children, depending on the age, manage through a quite stressful time. So the first thing, just in general, is of course that like adults, children and young people will experience probably the same amount of stress. The only difference is that how we express it might be different, or how we react to that stress might be different. So as adults, if you've gone through lots of different experience where you've had, of course, stress in your life, you will probably know yourself a bit better, or know the strategies that maybe help you. So for younger children and young people, that isn't always the case. They are still looking at the things or the strategies that actually help them to cope with stress. And stress in school can be the source of it can revolve a lot around a lot of things, like wanting to do well and wanting to have higher grades, maybe their friendship groups and the social side of school, or also expectations that they have from family, from teachers, or just expectations that they set themselves, which sometimes can be realistic, but not all the time. And that's when we will really see kind of stress peaking, is when we see that they have expectations of themselves that are unrealistic and too high and not manageable, and that makes it even harder to achieve what their goal or what they want to achieve, because those expectations are already too high from the beginning. They're unrealistic. As we all know, some stress is good, because when we feel stressed, we know that our body releases adrenaline, and so that for a short amount of time can actually help us to do well, to perform well, because our body feels that kind of rush of energy. So things like tests or presentations, or if we have a race or something like a team sport, it can help us to actually perform well and do well. But now it's thinking about how much stress am I feeling and for how long. It's really the duration of stress that then is important to think about. Depending on their age, of course, they might verbalize that, they might not. How young people kind of externalize stress is also very different. You'll have some who will become quite withdrawn and not want to actually express what's going on or how they're feeling, or kind of realize how much something might be affecting them. And then you'll have others who maybe will have mood swings or outbursts, or be more irritable. So it can really vary with how, although we all experience stress, and, the reaction our body has is automatically the same, but actually how we respond to it. So that's only the reaction that our body feels, but how we respond to it is what we need, is what we kind of need to learn constantly, so that next time that we experience stress, we know what actually helps us. So in general, like I said, our body reacts to stress when there is some kind of a challenge. So the physiological response, what we feel in our body, those kind of symptoms like, heart racing, sweaty hands, all those clouded thinking, all those things are what we would say our physiological responses, because, hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, they're released in the body. So that's why we kind of feel it in our body as well. And that is sometimes called the fight, flight, freeze response, what actually happens. And it's really, I think, in the moment, as we experience stress more and more, of course, we learn to recognize what it is. If we're thinking, of course, of our younger students, for them, that's actually much harder to realize up until, they learn what it is and they can identify it. So with our younger students, we would work on them actually differentiate and looking at what the difference is between, a normal stomachache because they've had something, that maybe was off or wasn't too good for them, or actually a stomachache because they're feeling stressed, or headaches. Is it a headache because I'm really tired and haven't slept, or I'm dehydrated, or is it a headache because I'm actually really stressed? So depending on the age, how we externalize that is something that we might look out for as parents. How do we know when our children are more stressed or less stressed, or they're becoming really overwhelmed, and whether they might reach out for help or not? We'll look at the things that you can do, even if they're not, themselves reaching out for that help, what we can do to create some kind of, I guess, of a positive environment, even, during a stressful time, like when there's an important deadline, or when, there's exams. So we're going to now look at three different types of stress. So the first one, which is, I guess, the most common, and it relates to when we have assessments or exam, is acute stress. So that's when we kind of know that there's going to be a stressor. So for example, knowing that next week I have a big assessment, summative assessment that's going to take place, or next month I have exams. So kind of knowing or anticipating an event that is going to be stressful. Now, of course, with that, stress, because we said it can be positive and negative, the positive type of stress would be, for example, if I know that a really exciting event is coming up, I might feel that same rush of energy, that my body will still produce that response, but it would be as a form of excitement. So with this type of stress, as long as it doesn't last for an extended period of time, actually we can cope quite well with it, because it's something that we need to have. Like I said, it helps us to, in a lot of cases, perform well, and we can also look at what we do to help ourselves before that event. So if we know that there's going to be an exam coming up, or there's going to be something that we need to hand in, what can we do to help ourselves in that situation, or what can you do as a parent to support them in that situation, knowing what the anticipated stressor is going to be. So a couple of months ago, when I did the workshop on uncertainty and what do we do when we have a lot of uncertainty, that's quite different from this, because in this type of stress, we actually know what the stressor is going to be. So we can actually start looking at how we will manage in that situation. We can almost prepare ourselves for it. The other type of stress is episodic acute stress. So that means that acute stress that we feel because we know there's something coming up, for example, maybe it might be an exam, we're having that type of stress more frequently. So for example, for those who, maybe in grade 12 will have exams maybe at one every day, or they know that they'll have a lot of, exams one after the other, or a lot of assessments in the same month, for example, we might see that type of acute stress occurring more frequently, or even just in general, if it's not related to school, but just experiencing that kind of high stress response more frequently. And this can then become a bit harder to manage, because unlike the type of stress that's just, that's acute stress that we know we have something coming up and we kind of try to prepare ourselves for it, we try to do things to help us keep well. This is when that type of stress happens more often. And so we start to see that it then affects, how we're feeling in terms of our mental health. It starts to affect how tired we are, maybe how much we sleep. And this type of stress can be affected by, three things and more, actually. But the main ones are increased responsibility. So if all of a sudden we have a lot more responsibility that we didn't have before, we might experience this type of stress more frequently. Or if we are now in a more demanding environment, so we know that the demands are actually higher than what our expectations are. And also when we start to you have catastrophizing patterns of worry, what they are is basically the types of thoughts that are kind of what we call all or nothing. So for example, I have this assessment coming up. If I fail this assessment, I'm actually going to fail the IB. So that type of thinking that we know realistically that's not going to happen, because I'll have lots of other chances to actually look at what my grade is and do well. But in the moment, it feels like that. It feels like if this doesn't go well, nothing else is going to go well, and I'm not going to cope. So that's what we would call catastrophizing thinking. And sometimes we can kind of get stuck in a vicious cycle of thinking like that when we're worried about something, or when we are kind of experiencing stress more often, because it feels like we can't see clearly. And we know that the more we are stressed, when cortisol is released, that means that our thinking is not going to be as clear as it usually is. It's going to be very clouded, and so we won't be able to kind of reason as we would if we're not experiencing that stress constantly. And the other type of stress is chronic acute stress. So this is a type of stress that is long term, so that we experience stress for such a long time that now it really starts to affect us. And a chronic acute stress is linked to a lot of physical conditions like heart disease, strokes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, depression, a lot of mental health problems as well, diabetes type 2. Um, and that is because, of course, our stress reaction, that fight, flight, or freeze, was not designed in our body to be activated all the time. If we're always activating that response and we're always feeling on edge, always under pressure, stuck in these worries, in which we are constantly stressed, of course, that will then start on the inside as well to have an effect on our body. And so, of course, today, the reason why I talk about these three is not, to create kind of a negative view on stress, but it's also to recognize and try to identify what type of stress yourself within your family that you might feel, and what are the things that we can do to help so that maybe it doesn't get to that point where it's become chronic. And even if it is chronic, of course, we can still do things to work on it. It doesn't mean that it's kind of like once it gets to that point, there's no way of helping myself. Of course, we can still help ourselves even if it gets to that point. But we want to really be aware of what the stress levels are so that it doesn't, of course, get to that point. So assessments like exam, like I said, we can call them experiences of acute stress, because we know it's going to come, and depending on the age of the young person or of the student, it might present itself in different ways. We might see outbursts, we might see mood swings, we might see actually not wanting to speak to the rest of the family, isolating themselves, spending more time in their bedroom, not wanting, to maybe share what's going on because things feel so overwhelming. And it can affect the whole family. Whenever something happens in the family or to one member of the family, it of course can change the dynamics within the family, can affect everyone else in the family. And stress is definitely one of them. If one person in the family is feeling really stressed, maybe about, an exam or something that's happening in their school life or in their personal life, it can, of course, have an effect on everyone else. Let's say that you usually have dinner together, and then one member of the family decides, actually, it's too much. I just need to spend time in my bedroom and eat on my own. So that will already change that dynamic, even for one event. So it's quite natural that anything that actually happens to one member will have an effect on the other member of the family. And so when we're looking at how can I help that person, it's not just looking at how do I help my child, but it's how do I help my child within the family, within our context, because that actually matters a lot when we're trying to help, young people get through something. And stress is an example of that. Of course, if that's happening and there's, if you have more than one student going through exams or going through assessments, you might also be feeling under pressure. That's natural as well. Like I said, it will have some kind of an effect for everyone. Or if you're seeing your child under a lot of pressure, you might then also feel like, okay, if they're feeling so much pressure, maybe they're overwhelmed, and so we would worry of how they're going to deal with that pressure. So what is your role in that? So what can we do? Like I said, if there are reactions like mood swings or outbursts when a young person is stressed, we also want to think about the environment at home. So if we know that school life, or when they're in school, it's a quite stressful day for them, or it's going to be, quite stressful month, ahead, we need to then think about what does that pressure or what does the environment look like at home, starting from their bedroom, the environment which they spend probably most of their time when they're at home. Is it a positive environment? Does it help them with if they're feeling already overwhelmed, and then we go into a space that's maybe quite negative, it makes us feel maybe even more overwhelmed. We want to help them to actually consider where do you study? Where do you try to study? Do you let enough air and light come in? Do you have everything that's, so messy that you can't even begin to, think where I'm going to sit to study? So thinking about that environment, the environment in their proximity, so their bedroom, but also thinking about the whole household. What type of environment are we creating? What type of atmosphere do we create at home? And so then it becomes important to look out for the signs that they might be becoming too overwhelmed. So things like are their sleep patterns completely, changing or drastically changing? Is their appetite changing? Are you finding that they're eating more, for example, late at night, or having less appetite? Or is their behavior changing, how they respond or how they react? So those are all really good indications, regardless of the age, actually. This is relevant for both younger students and for older. Whenever we see, kind of changes like that in how we are, what we eat, and how much we sleep, generally those are good indications that something is happening. We are somehow feeling overwhelmed. And if that has to do with exams or assessments, then we'll see actually then how can we communicate so that they feel supported through that period of time that's probably going to be quite stressful and cause that acute stress. Before we do that, of course, we need to, before we try to help anyone else, as parents, within your work or with anything that we do, before we want to try and help someone else, we have to consider how we are. If I'm feeling really overwhelmed and I go to speak to a student and I'm feeling already overwhelmed, I'm automatically, transferring that feeling of pressure and that feeling of not being calm to the other person. So when we're trying to have those types of conversations, or when we want to kind of deal with something that we know isn't maybe a particularly easy topic to talk about, we need to consider how we are ourselves. So if it is, for example, that there's a deadline coming up, there's going to be a summative assessment, there's going to be an exam, and maybe you're worried, for your child. Think about, what are you worried about specifically? Is it about the grade? Is it about how they'll perform? Is it about their progress? What is it specifically? So that when we have those conversations, we can actually express, I'm worried about this in detail, not just in general. Because again, that's something that if they're already worried in general about an exam, for example, or they're kind of stuck in that catastrophizing, if I fail this, then that's it, it's the end. We're not also then helping them to realistically think about what that exam will bring, whether it's a pass or fail, what would that consequence be in a more logical and realistic way. So then we're automatically then thinking about how the type of language that we use, how we want to, also portray our worries to them, so that it doesn't become that we're really overwhelmed and we shift that feeling to them, we transfer that to them. There's a fine line between doing that, and sometimes it happens without even realizing, of course, because we're human. If I'm feeling really overwhelmed, I might automatically transfer that to someone else. But when a young person is already under a lot of stress, and they receive and they absorb more stress from other people, of course it becomes more difficult to manage and to deal with. So this is when communication then within the family as a whole becomes really important. So we'll look at now some things that we can do in terms of communication. So in any relationship within a family, romantic relationship, any type of friendship, communication is key. And we know that when actually communication patterns are very poor, we know that it becomes difficult to actually manage problems. It's difficult in general sometimes to have good communication within a family, because you might all be busy. Everyone has their own duties and things that they need to do. So it becomes harder to actually make space and time to speak to each other. And that's understandable, because if everyone's busy, of course, it's going to be more difficult to have, the same communication as maybe you would during, the winter break, where you have more time off. Depending on the child's age, they might also, of course, if they are withdrawn or isolating themselves, they might make it harder for you to actually be able to speak to them. And so what we want to do is to create to set the tone for what that open and positive communication looks like. So we want to, like I've said in other workshops, we want to model that behavior. If we are expecting our child to come and speak to us about how they're feeling, it needs to be something that is done within the family, that's quite common and is done kind of in the family. If it's quite a new thing and no one else does it in the family, but we expect the one member of the family to do it, then it almost feels like an obligation, like the person has to do it. So if we want that open communication, we need to also show what that open communication looks like. What are you willing to share about how you're feeling without transferring, everything, the pressure onto someone else? But how does that positive communication look like within the family? How does everyone communicate with each other? So tip number one, if we've noticed, signs that that our child is stressed and that they're becoming more overwhelmed, and we have found a time to communicate together and to try to have, maybe go for a walk or do something where we're going to talk, we want to do active listening. And that sounds very simple, like, yeah, just listen and then kind of reply. But active listening is actually very difficult to do. It's not simple, because active listening means giving the person a chance to, say what they want to say, but we're not thinking straight away of, I need to resolve this, I need to find a solution. It's not about that. It's actually just giving them that space and time to listen, and that's it. Sometimes they might not even want you as a parent to help them, do a schedule for revision. They might not want that. They might already know what they need to do to study, but they might just need someone to just sit and listen to maybe the frustrations, to maybe what's causing some of the worries or some of the stress. And so active listening looks like actually just dedicating a time to actually sit down and talk, but without feeling that kind of pressure, or without feeling the need to come up with a solution for them. We let them come up with their own solution, and often that works better. Whenever we are given a solution by someone else, it doesn't have the same effect as actually us coming up with that solution to help ourselves. Number two, we want to validate their feelings. As a parent, you might have gone through a lot of exams, a lot of deadlines, a lot of challenges in work, family. And so it might be something that you're more used to dealing with. You might kind of know maybe what helped you. Again, thinking about, them coming up with their own solution, with their own strategies, validating their feelings is actually a really good way of doing that for them. Even whatever grade they're in, grade 6, grade 5, grade 10, grade 12, that moment that of stress is probably, the only thing that they can see. They can't see that, yes, in a year's time, I'll look back and I'll laugh, because actually I managed to get through it, and I'll be able to smile and see that it went well. In the moment, if that's the most important thing to them, and it's maybe really affecting how they're feeling, we need to validate and acknowledge that I can see that actually it is really affecting you, and that this exam is really important for you. So we want to validate what they're telling us, what they're saying, even if we maybe know that next week or once the exam is over, all those feelings are going to go away. But in the moment, if that's really important for them, we need to acknowledge that without minimizing or saying, you'll be fine, don't worry, I've done loads of these, you'll be fine, or everyone's done them, so you'll be fine. So that type of language, sometimes just shifting how we say that, can really make a big difference. So things like, if, for example, they're trying to revise or to write a paper or to do something, and we say, have you finished yet? Have you done it? Have you handed it in? Sometimes if we just shift that to asking things like, how far have you got? How far have you managed to do? So just kind of changing how we are also saying that, so that the other person doesn't become defensive straight away and actually doesn't take in what we are trying to say, which is probably that you're trying to just support them. The third thing is to show trust, that we trust that, we don't try to, be there in a way that becomes overwhelming or too controlling. We want to trust that they'll also, will give them a chance to try and actually show us that they're being responsible. So that's kind of with everything. And it goes back to validating their feeling, to showing trust that they'll be able to help themselves through it, so we can be supportive without resolving things for them. Tip 4 is to give praise. And we hear about giving praise in school and in all types of environments, how when we receive positive feedback, that helps us want to do well. But in this case, if we're thinking about exams, if we're thinking about assessments, or things that need papers that need to be handed in, giving praise isn't just giving praise for once we have the result, once we get the report with all the grades, we can praise that they've done a good job. Giving praise also refers to seeing how much effort they're putting in. If they are trying to revise, if they are trying to do things to help themselves, we want to praise that process before whatever is handed in, rather than just the fact that they've received a good grade for it, or even just the fact that they've actually handed it in on time, that they've been responsible, and that they've handed in what they needed to in time, and that they've taken time to try to help themselves. So we want to praise that process before it actually happens, rather than just what the outcome is. And often that makes it more worthwhile, that feedback. And if there is a stressful time like that, we want to make time to do things together. And if you're working and you're busy, running your household, maybe work or the family, and you have a lot of things going on, actually doing things together can become difficult. Right now, of course, we have restrictions which make it harder to maybe do some of the things that will normally help, like sports or going to places or traveling, things that would normally help to do something together. So that means that we have to think, more about the things that we can do together as a family all together, things that are positive, that don't involve, conversations that always revolve around, what's happening at school, or just things that are more fun that we can help to distract everyone in the family, but making time for it, not just on the weekends, but in the weekdays as well. And using open questions. So, like I said, it's really important when we are asking questions that have to do with, exams or assessments, if they're already feeling under pressure and they know they have something that they need to hand in. Of course, they might already be defensive if we ask them, "Have you finished with that? Or did you do it?" Because they're already feeling under pressure, they might just answer in a defensive way, like, "Yes, I've done it," or, "Why are you asking me?" All these questions. And then we're actually not having an open and positive communication, because one person will get defensive, maybe you might raise voices, and it can end up in an argument. So for it to not escalate into an argument, we want to try using open-ended questions, like how I said earlier: how far have you got? Is there anything that you want me to help you with? Can I be helpful in this situation? Do you need help with anything? So just asking open-ended questions that we know they won't kind of be likely to answer in a defensive way. And looking as a whole family, I wanted to share with you some kind of tips for self-care for, young people might be going through stress, but things that you can do also just as a family. So when we're stressed, we hear about things, take care of yourself, self-care, but we hear a lot more of the kind of glamorous and cosmetic sides with, like, doing a face mask or a bubble bath. But if we really are under stress and overwhelmed, the type of self-care will change, from person to person. And those are things that help us to keep well, helps us to keep our head above water. So things like having a balance between school life and home life, personal life and school. So what does their balance look like? Are they aware of how much energy they're dedicating to one area or the other? Or if it's kind of imbalanced, how can they balance that out? Having regular meals together, it's so important, especially if you're really busy, to actually still have some time, at dinner time, to spend that time together, all at the table. And that's actually a good time for you also to notice how they're managing, how they're doing. We want to encourage them to actually get out and have fresh air. If they're trying to revise, or they know they have to hand something in, they might be stuck, in their bedroom for long periods of time. And that isn't always helpful to do that, for too long. If it's, for example, a weekend, we want to encourage and maybe do something together. Plan to do something together that is outdoors. And then on the right, there's kind of some techniques that you can use as a family or individually. So I don't know if you've heard before of a self-care box. So what that is basically creating a box. Maybe it could be for the family, it could be for the individual, for the young person, but you basically create a box in which you try to put in positive things that will help you when you need them. So for some, it might be family photos. For some, it might be something to do that's sensory, or it might be something to look at, or an activity or a game. So we want to create for ourselves kind of a go-to box for when we're feeling really stressed. And it can be for the whole family. It could be a family self-care box that that, I don't know, once during the week, you have a night where you take, something from there, whether it's games or photos, and you can do something together. If it's for the individual, they want to think about, if it's for young people, we want to encourage them to think of the things that generally help them, smile, help them feel happy. And we want to try to kind of put them in some kind of a box. And the idea of that is that when we're overwhelmed, when we're under stress, when we're not feeling well in ourselves, it's hard to think of ways to help ourselves. It's hard to think, okay, I need to go and do this to help myself, because we're just stuck in that moment. We're stuck in our thoughts, and we can't think clearly enough to say, I need to do this breathing technique, or I need to do this, to help myself. So actually having a physical place where all of those things go can help in the moment, to have kind of a go-to place or area or box where I know there's going to be something there to try out. The second one is a positive jump. Again, this can be done just for the young person, or it can be done as a family. And I've seen it in both. I've, supported families in which they've done it as a whole family, and it's worked really well. And that positive jar could be either writing down events or moments or things in the family that happened, which made people smile, which made people laugh, that were positive experiences. Like, I don't know, if you celebrate a certain holiday and there was something really nice that happened, or you just want to remember that particular holiday, that maybe you went somewhere or someone said a funny joke, anything that's positive, we want to put it in little notes in kind of like a jar or a bottle. And the idea of that is that when we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, we can, after a long time, we can imagine that the jar is filled up, and we can try to, take a note out to actually read. This can be a really good strategy also just for self-esteem for young people, in which, as a family, or they can write down things that they like about themselves that help them feel better. And then when they need them, either together, they're good reminders of the positive things that they do have in their life. And again, this goes back to, if we're stressed, if we're overwhelmed, we can't think of the positive things. We just think of everything that's going bad, or the negative things, or the upcoming stressful event. How can we balance that out? Not dismiss it. We still acknowledge the negative, but how can we balance it out with reminding ourselves of those positives? So a positive jar can work like that. A communication book is another one that can help during busy times in the family, during stressful times. What that looks like is different for every family. So I know some family that has used it as a way of writing, anyone can write down something that they want to speak to the other member of the family at some point. For example, if I'm the child, I might write down, Mom, I need to speak to you at some point about my lunch, or about the fact that I need to go to somewhere, or I need to buy something. So you can either have it as that, as a reminder, but it can also be, if right now I don't want to talk, we decide when is a good time to talk, or you can write messages in there to each other that maybe don't feel as comfortable, to say it in person, or that can open up a conversation. So that's something that you can really adjust to your needs and to the needs of the family. But I've seen it work in families really well to open up communication a bit more, especially if you're feeling like you are stuck in a communication pattern that isn't positive and maybe might be a bit dysfunctional. This could be a really good way of trying to shift the atmosphere around communicating openly. And these are just some idea. Of course, if there's anything more specific, or you are going through a lot of stress at the moment as a family, that you want some tips, or you want to know, maybe if we're talking about language, what are the things that maybe I should avoid saying, or things like that, you have my email. I'm quite open, to having any questions and seeing if we can, provide a bit more support. But I'll just come out of sharing my screen. Okay, yes. Yeah, so I don't know if you had any comments, or either in the comment box, or, you can unmute yourself, you can ask any questions or any thoughts. These might be things that were relevant to you. They might be things that kind of you already knew, but also just to give an indication of the type of content that we cover in these workshops.
I have anything to say.
Oh, hello, yes. Sorry, I was thinking that Jackie's going to ask.
Thank you.